We're beginning Chapter 20, Busting the Industry Myths. The drug industry's myths about their activities and motives have been repeated so often that they are widely believed by doctors, politicians, and the general public, as they are an impediment for creating a rational healthcare system devoid of corruption. I shall debunk the worst of them before suggesting reforms in the next chapter. Myth number 1. Drugs are expensive because of the high discovery and development costs. The former CEO of Merck, Raymond Gilmartin, has admitted that this is a myth. The price of medicines isn't determined by the research costs. Instead, it is determined by their value in preventing and treating disease. Gilmartin forgot to mention that prices of drugs not only reflect what society is willing to pay, but also how good the companies are at keeping competition at bay. Anti-competitive activities are widespread, and price fixing is common. We often hear that is costs $800 million in 2000 to bring in a new drug to the market. But this is false. It is based on flawed methods, debatable accounting theory, and premised on blind faith and confidential information supplied by the drug industry to its economic consultants at 2 universities who were paid by the same industry. The true cost is likely to be below $100 million. Zidovudine, the first AIDS drug, was synthesized at the Michigan Cancer Foundation in 1964. It caused Burroughs Wellcome very little to develop it, but the company nevertheless charged $10,000 per year for one patient in 1987. It was a clear abuse of a monopoly situation, with desperately ill patients demanding the drug whatever its cost. When Abbott in 2003 suddenly increased the price of the AIDS drug ritonavir by 400%, the invention of which had been supported by millions of dollars of taxpayers' money, it caused an outrage of hundreds of doctors. It caused an outrage of hundreds of doctors decided to boycott all Abbott's products whenever possible. A similar example is imatinib, Gilvec, or Gleevec, which is very effective against chronic myeloid leukemia. Novartis had synthesized it but wasn't interested in it until a hematologist researched it and found out it was highly effective. Again, development costs were minimal, but that didn't prevent Novartis from charging $25,000 a year for a year's treatment in 2002. Taxol is one of our most useful cancer drugs. It was derived from the bark of the Pacific yew tree and later synthesized by National Institute of Health funded scientists. The drug was handed over to Bristol Myers Squibb, who, despite minimal development costs, took $10,000 to $20,000 for a year's treatment in 1993. When the patent ran out, the company sued everyone that planned to market a cheaper generic. 29 U.S. states sued Bristol Myers Squibb for violating antitrust laws. But while all this went along before the case was settled at a cost of only $135 million for the company, it gained revenues of more than $5 billion. After several companies marketing generic versions of citalopram for some reason had withdrawn their products from the Danish market in 2010. The price for the drug suddenly increased by a factor of 12. The companies that increased the price declined to comment. Another curious example was when all companies marketing generic simvastatin, used by 6% of all Danes, suddenly multiplied the price of the 40 milligram dose by 8. The 40 milligram dose was the most commonly used one. The drug was also available at 20 milligram dose at only a fifth of the price. But according to the law, the pharmacies are not allowed to hand out the cheap dose and tell the patients to take 2 tablets instead of 1. Although the 5 companies raised the price to exactly the same level, to the second decimal, they denied price fixing. The authorities launched a trenching investigation. This dirty trick would cost Danish taxpayers an additional 63 million euros annually for an off-patent drug. Shearing bought a hormone from another company for use in women with menopausal symptoms and sold the drug with a markup of 7,000%. And when Librium and Valium were patented, Roche sold them in Colombia for 65 times the price on the European market. In 2006, the U.S. Federal Trade Commission opened a court against Lundbeck, alleging that the company had taken advantage of a monopoly situation to milk seriously ill infants. Lundbeck had bought a U.S. company which had increased the price of an old, life-saving drug, indomethacin, by 1,300%. After having bought it from Merck, there weren't any development costs behind these price explosions. For many years, the obstetricians had used a natural hormone for preventing premature birth, progesterone, which came on the market more than 50 years ago. The pharmacies prepared it for the doctors, and it cost about $10 to $20 per injection. When KV Pharmaceutical won U.S. government approval to exclusively sell the drug, known as Makena, the price went up to $1,500 a dose, an increase of 75 to 150 times. The company bullshittingly declared these moms deserve the opportunity to have the benefits of an FDA-approved Makenas, while doctors said that the deal was likely to lead to more premature births and therefore also to more permanently brain-damaged children, as many women would be unable to afford the drug. Some doctors said they were happy getting the cheaper version of the compounding pharmacies, but the company responded by sending cease and desist letters to compounding pharmacies, telling them they could wait, I messed up somewhere. Backing it up a little bit. The company bullshittingly declared that these moms deserved the opportunity to have the benefits of an FDA-approved Makena, while doctors said that the deal was likely to lead to more premature births and therefore also to more permanently brain-damaged children, as many women would be unable to afford the drug. Some doctors said they were happy getting the cheaper version of the drug for compounding pharmacies, but the company responded by sending cease and desist letters to compounding pharmacies, telling them they could face FDA enforcement actions if they kept marketing the drug. We are jointly responsible for the complicated society we have created, where we depend on each other and benefit from specialization. But when the drug companies charge copious amounts for their drugs, they make a mockery for their obligations toward the patients, the taxpayers, our societies, and our joint assets, to such an extent that they out themselves outside society, just like street criminals do. It is theft. Researchers have shown that the yearly cost per patient is inversely related to the prevalence of the disease. Italian researchers went a step further and developed a simple formula that fitted surprisingly well with the data they had for 17 cancer drugs. Yearly cost per patient equals 2 million euros. I'm not reading that. Thus, the annual cost per patient for a drug where there are 900 patients in Italy will be about 60,000 euros. Accordingly, drugs for patients with rare enzyme deficiencies are monstrously expensive. For example, $600,000 a year for treating Gaucher's disease. Although all research and early development was done entirely by NIH-funded scientists, a final blow to the myth that the drug prices reflect the high research and development costs is, what can then be said about the much higher costs for sales promotion? Those who pay for the drugs also pay for this extravagant marketing. If new drugs were as good as the industry wants us to believe they are, there wouldn't ne- there wouldn't be need there wouldn't be much need for pushing them and for bribing doctors to use them. Myth number 2. If we don't use expensive drugs, innovation will dry out. This myth is widely believed by politicians and doctors, although it is totally ludicrous. While these believers be ready to pay 20 times more for their new car just because the car dealer tells them that by doing so, we'll get better cars in the future? According to Marcia Engel, former editor of the New England Journal of Medicine, the drug industry insists that they should be essentially left alone without societal control, and they also threaten our societies. Don't mess with us. Do nothing about our obscene profits. Do nothing about these unsustainable increases in prices, or else we will not give you your miracle cures. Usually companies say, if we don't spend our money on research, we'll die. Drug companies say, if we don't get your money to spend on research, you'll die. Only religious leaders are smarter. They promise we'll be rewarded after we've died, which makes complaints impossible. The industry's promises are also false. Indeed, so false that the cause-effect relationship is the reverse. Since the 1980s, profits in the drug industry have skyrocketed. But in the same period, fewer and fewer innovative drugs have come onto the market. La Revue Prescrire gives an award every year to the most important breakthrough, La Pilule d'Or, the golden pill, but couldn't find a worthy candidate for 2012 or 2011 or 2010. In 2011, the Danish region suggested to create an institute like the National Institute for Health and Care Excellence, NICE, in the United Kingdom, as we cannot afford everything on offer. However, a conservative speaker on health in Parliament didn't want to prioritize drugs and argue it would slow down the development of new drugs if we introduce a maximum we would pay for the drugs. The regions furthermore suggested that the drugs should be tested against existing and often cheaper drugs before they could be approved. This enraged the director of the Danish Association of the Pharmaceutical Industry, Ida Sophie Jensen, who said it was pathetic if not shameless that Danish regions again showed their industry hostile attitudes. The regions blame the drug industry for their poor economy. The chairman for the regions responded calmly that the drug industry is one of the most profitable of all industries, and that he hoped the industry's ritual tribal dance would soon be over. The fact is that the cost of the drugs at the Danish hospital trebled in just 8 years. The year before, the Danish government removed the reimbursement for some drugs that were far too expensive and not any better than cheaper drugs of the same type. In response to this, Ida Sophie Jensen displayed another tribal dance. The authorities refused to pay for progress in medicines. We fear this will stop the development of new drugs. In contrast, a health economist remarked that the move might give the industry an incentive to search for real breakthroughs instead of Me Too drugs. That's exactly the point. Innovation has dried out because it's more lucrative for industry to develop Me Too products than to do innovative research. Patients will benefit if we remove this incentive. All over the world, apart from the United States under Republican rule, governments tried to contain drug costs. An article from 2011 reported that the Czech Republic would introduce maximum prices for drugs that were reimbursed and limit the use of very expensive drugs at the university hospitals. In Germany, a price ceiling was introduced with an aim of saving 2 billion euros annually. In the United Kingdom, the government required that the industry reduce its prices, aiming at saving 6 billion euros annually. And in Australia, the government removed reimbursement for 162 drugs and planned to cut the prices for 1,600 drugs by 27%. China, Hungary, Bulgaria, and Slovakia also had cost-saving plans. The way New Zealand has contained its spending on drugs is impressive and simple. In 1993, it was decided to subsidize drugs in the same class. For example, NSAIDs or SSRIs, selective serotonin reuptake inhibitors, that had similar effects with the same amount, whatever the prices of the drugs were referencing by pricing. In addition, drug companies negotiate with the drug agency over price and other conditions for access. The policy had dramatic effects. Statins were provided at half the cost compared to Australia, and the price of generic drugs was less than a quarter of the price in Canada. The community drug budget increased at an annual rate of only 2% compared with 15% before the new policy. And at the same time, public coverage was improved. Although there are only 4.4 million inhabitants in the country, the annual savings amounted to 1 billion euros. Myth number 3. Savings are greater than costs for expensive drugs. At a meeting with the drug industry where this argument was put forward, the director of the Danish National Board of Health said that it was curious that no matter how expensive a new drug was, the company was always able to provide a pharmacoeconomic analysis that showed that the savings in terms of less sick leave, premature retirement, and whatever else was greater than the cost of the drug. Economy is a very soft discipline, and you can get almost any result you want depending on the assumptions you put into the model. It is hard to imagine a greater conflict of interest than when a drug company concocts a pharmacoeconomic analysis of its own drug, or asks an economist to do it for hire. The outcome is never negative for the company. Myth number 4. Breakthroughs come from industry-funded research. An often heard argument is that none of our drugs were invented by former socialist countries east of the Iron Curtain. That proves nothing. There was so much else that didn't work out in these countries under dictatorship rule. The misconception is huge. Virtually all the basic science that enables modern medicine to move forward takes place in the nonprofit sector, at universities, research institutes, and government laboratories. A U.S. Congress report from 2000 noted that of the 21 most important drugs introduced between 1965 and 1992, 15 were developed using knowledge and techniques from federally funded research. Other studies had found the same. For example, at least 80% of 35 major drugs were based on scientific discoveries made by public sector research institutions. The National Cancer Institute played the lead role in the development of 58 new cancer drugs approved by the FDA between 1955 and 2001. Three of the most important discoveries in the 20th century, penicillin, insulin, and the polio vaccine, all came from publicly funded laboratories. The National Institute of Health conducted an investigation on the five top-selling drugs in 1995: Zantac, ranitidine for ulcers, Zovirax, acylcovir for herpes, Capoten, Captopril for high blood pressure, Vasotec, Enalapril for high blood pressure, and Prozac, fluoxetine for depression, and found that 16 of the key 17 scientific papers leading to this discovery and development of these drugs came from outside the industry. The picture is very consistent. The first breakthrough in AIDS also came from public research, and the US government spent double as much on research as all the drug companies taken together. The typical story is that drug companies invest relatively little in the real breakthroughs, but when they take over from publicly funded research, they sell the drug at an exorbitant price. They have a monopoly. In addition, they routinely lie about the research and often steal the credit for the drug and claim they found it themselves. The much-touted public-private partnerships fall totally apart when the private part constantly runs away with all the money and all the credit, making the rest of society look like a fool or a victim of robbery. Drug companies spend only 1% of revenues on basic research to discover new molecules, net of taxpayer subsidies, and more than 4/5 of all funds for research to discover new drugs and vaccines come from public sources. An important reason why most breakthroughs come from publicly funded research is that capitalism and curiousness go very badly together. It takes time to be curious, and senior people in drug companies don't have the patience. They want a quick return on their investments, which will help them advance to even more lucrative positions in other companies. Managers are therefore likely to shut down a particular line of research if there hasn't been any progress after a couple of years. Psychologists have shown that money is a poor motivator, in contrast to giving people something meaningful to do. And scientists are radically different from managers. The salary isn't important. What matters is solving the puzzles and contributing something of importance to the world. As an example, it took more than 20 years for an indefatigable scientist, Eugene Goldwasser, to find and purify the first small vial of human erythropoietin. Myth number 5. Drug companies compete in a free market. This myth is used successfully to decrease regulation in the mistaken belief that market forces will solve all problems. There can be no free market for products that are heavily subsidized by taxpayers' money and when fraud and crimes are widespread. When I worked in the industry, I was surprised to find out how the price of drugs is determined. Sales managers produced what they called a sales budget for the coming years, but I wondered how they could make a budget for money they didn't have but only hoped to get. However, once it had been made, it was important to live up to it. Otherwise, uncomfortable questions would be asked, and people would be unhappy. There is a simple solution when sales aren't going well: to increase the price for the drug and agree with your main competitors to increase their prices by the same amount, which will make everybody happy. It's illegal, but very difficult to prove, and therefore common. I have seen it happen, although I have never been responsible for a sales budget. Myth number 6. Public industry partnerships are beneficial for patients. This myth never dies, and we saw one of the most shameless examples in 2012. The Association of the British Pharmaceutical Industry, ABPI, issued a new guidelines to promote collaboration with doctors. It talked about shared aims and objectives and urged healthcare professionals not to be tempted to accept the negative myths about cooperating with industry. Endorsed by many, including the British Medical Association, the Royal College of General Practitioners, the Academy of Medical Royal Colleges, and the Department of Health. The Lancet's logo was used to support outrageous claims such as industry plays a valid and important role in the provision of medical education and medical representatives can be useful resources for healthcare professionals. Under a heading called The Facts, the guidelines starts with 2 untrue statements. Opportunities may be missed or even rejected because of misconceptions stemming from historical practices that are no longer acceptable or the actions of a few individuals that are not typical of the working relationship between healthcare professionals and the industry. Just a few bad apples, huh? These practices are not historical and they are not atypical. Further, the guideline is said to reflect the industry's determination to ensure the relationships with healthcare professionals are based on integrity, honesty, knowledge, appropriate behaviors, transparency, and trust. We are also told all trials are subject to rigorous scrutiny. The results of controlled clinical trials are made available in the public domain. Association of the British Pharmaceutical Industry, APBI Code of Practice requires disclosure of details of clinical trials. The reality is that we never see details of clinical trials. Loads of results are buried and effectively sealed in company archives as effectively as if it were nuclear waste. And the trials are never subjected to rigorous scrutiny as the ethics committees don't do it and don't have the expertise to do it. The guidance claims that undertaken appropriately working with industry will not harm objectively or clinical decision making. Wait a minute. The guidance's claims that undertaken appropriately working with industry will not harm objectivity of clinical decision making, and the regulations ensure that professional and ethical standards are upheld, are at odds with everything we know about the subject. We are also told that pharmaceutical industry investment is the source of the most scientific breakthroughs and innovations in medicine. Typically costs 550 million British pounds to do all the work necessary before a medicine can be licensed for use. I have never seen so much bullshit and lies crammed into one place before. Partnerships can occasionally be beneficial for both sides, but overall, it's immensely harmful for patients that the establishment embraces the industry's ways with its drugs. The idea that public health and the drug industry have a common agenda is PR fiction, and the UK healthcare system is already at an ethical bottom level. In 2012, the UK government announced the general practitioners will be expected to work with drug companies to work out how to treat their patients. The Association of the British Pharmaceutical Industries guide supported the Department of Health says that popular areas for joint working you may wish to consider include identification of undiagnosed patients, reviewing uncontrolled patients, improving patient adherence to medicines and treatment pathway redesign. Includes inviting salespersons to go through the GP's patients' lists and pick out those they think should receive the company's drugs. The British must live on another planet than I do. They should read Chapter 12 about Neurontin for Everything, where salespeople also sat with doctors and their patients and suggested what they should do. What we should do is the exact opposite. Identify overdiagnosed and overtreated patients, take patients off most or all of their drugs, and treat them and teach them that a life without drugs is possible for most of us. In his book, Bad Pharma, Ben Goldays writes that the silverbacks, the great and good of British medicine, know full well what the problems with all this are, but have decided to be unconcerned. Thereby, like the regulators, they actively conspire in secrecy about... Excuse me. Lost my place here. Like the regulators, they actively conspire in secrecy about what drug companies are really doing to public health. Excuse me. It is hard to imagine a worse betrayal than this. If I were a GP in the UK, I would get another job or leave the country. Also, in 2012, the International Diabetes Federation, an umbrella organization of more than 200 diabetes associations in over 160 countries, started a partnership with Nestle, which intensely markets energy-dense confectionery and sugar-sweetened beverages. Nestle has caused many deaths in the developing world because of its unethical promotion of infant formula, which needs addition of clean water that is often not available. Perhaps our lung association should follow the fashion and partner with the tobacco industry. Why not? Politicians might acclaim to it. Politicians might acclaim it. There we go. I'm over here adding words. Myth number 7. Drug trials are done to improve the treatments of patients. PR material and collaborative agreements between doctors' associations and industry associations propagate this myth. However, no matter what the drug industry says about working for patients, they have no more responsibility to oversee the public's health than the fast food industry has to oversee the public's diet. And they are not genuinely interested in it. Either a study is designed to maximize sales, or it is designed to determine the best way to prevent or treat a particular health problem. When patients are recruited for trials, a benefit of participation that is almost always described in the consent document that is messed up again. When patients are recruited for trials, a benefit of participation that is almost always described in the consent document is that the research participant will contribute to scientific knowledge, which will in turn contribute positively to the care of other patients. However, as I explained in Chapter 5, this social contract with patients is broken. Trials are done for marketing purposes, and unwelcome results are kept secret or are distorted before they get published, although their availability would have improved the treatments of patients. Another myth is that the industry would have no point in cheating, as it would always be detected and influence sales negatively. One of the persons who told me this conducted clinical trials for a Danish company. He was convinced he was right and was proud of his job. Good for him. But he wasn't the one who analyzed the data and made decisions about how they should be interpreted and whether they were so harmful for profits that they would never see the light of day outside the company. As I have documented in this book, the truth is that companies cheat a lot because it can rarely be detected without having access to the raw data and because it pays off. Myth number 8. We need many drugs of the same type because patients vary in their response. I have heard this argument countless times for doctors who have listened to the pep talks of drug salespeople without reflecting much on whether it was true or not. In rare cases, it could be true, but I have not seen convincing data that confirms it. One of the trials that purported to show that patients reacted differently was a crossover trial where patients with rheumatoid arthritis tried 4 different drugs and told the investigators which period they preferred. This doesn't prove anything, as the severity of the pain fluctuates. To be sure that the preferences aren't just random noise, we would need to expose the same patients to the same drugs more than once. Myth number 9. Don't use generic drugs, as their potency varies. Pfizer once claimed that its own tests of generic products that contained the same active substances as Pfizer's drug against dizziness had shown that 10 of 17 generic products failed to meet potency standards. Contrast this with the fact that drug agencies ensure that generic products are bioequivalent with the original drug by requiring comparative studies in human volunteers that measure the concentrations of the active substance in the blood. Many doctors believe in this nonsense, which has been consistently rejected whenever researchers without conflicts of interest did the bioavailability studies. Myth number 10. The industry pays for continuing medical education because the public purse won't. If true, this would be an act of immense generosity, as it is expensive and affects most doctors. As I have explained in Chapter 8, it is so clear what this what I have explained in Chapter 8, it is so clear what this is all about that not even the drug industry's representative bodies deny it, but admit it. That's how they do business. 3 of the largest U.S. advertising agencies handling pharmaceutical accounts invest in contract research organizations and prepare educational packages for the drug industry. As Marcia Engels said in an interview, the companies perpetrate a gigantic fiction that they somehow are not only in the business of selling drugs, but are also in the medical education business. Their investors expect them to make as high profits as they possibly can by selling drugs, but they have managed to make a lot of people believe that they are also somehow educating them. That can't be. It's as though you look to beer companies to educate you about alcoholism. There is also the conflict of interest. Drug companies might educate doctors about drugs as long as they're talking about the benefits, but they're going to say our drug isn't really very... Wait a minute. But are they going to say our drug isn't really very good? The other company makes a better drug? No, it doesn't happen. Why would it? The general system failure calls for a revolution. Next time.